Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer Doliak. I'm a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center and an economics professor at Texas A&M University. And I want to welcome you to this initial session in our webinar series on how to reduce violent crime. This is, of course, a policy issue of great interest as violent crime has been increasing in a number of places across the United States over the past year and a half. And so this is the first of 5 webinars on this topic. We're gonna have 1 hour each Monday during the same hour, 12 p.m. Eastern. We're all in different time zones here for today, and then the next 4 weeks, where we'll bring you 5 short talks during that hour to get you up to speed on what the best research says about what we can do about this. What's effective, what isn't at reducing violent crime, with a particular emphasis on what policymakers should be taking away from the research. I'm extremely grateful to the Niskanen Center for hosting this. This is part of a new criminal justice program at Niskanen, so please keep tabs on the work that that terrific team is doing if you're interested in topics like this. You can follow them on Twitter. I know that Greg Newbern has a Friday or Monday newsletter you can subscribe to, so do take a look at that. I think we can get started, dive right in here. So David Phillips is going to kick things off. And David, you have 10 minutes.
Okay, I think I successfully unmuted and shared my slides. As Jen said, my name is David Phillips, coming to you from University of Notre Dame, where I work at the Lab for Economic Opportunities, or LEO. And I'm going to be talking about a project about emergency financial assistance for people at risk of homelessness and whether that can reduce violent crime. This is joint work with a couple of my colleagues from LEO, Carrie Palmer, who is an undergrad here, and Jim Sullivan, who's one of the co-founders of the lab. So for this piece of research, I'd like you to, there we go. I'd like you to think about 2 sets of headlines you may have been seeing recently and think about them as maybe more connected than you might otherwise. So you've probably seen these headlines about the housing crisis during the pandemic. Right, if you go to the census poll survey, for instance, they show right now they're finding that about 16% of people say that they're behind on their rent currently. That's about 11 million people in the United States. It affects people of color more than other households. And you start seeing headlines like this, right? That as the eviction moratorium at the federal level and many local level ones as well are starting to fade away, there's this concern that there's going to be a sort of wave of evictions. A second set of headlines that you're probably familiar with if you're showing up at this particular set of talks is about violent crime, right? So there's also been a similarly common set of headlines about rises in violence in the United States. Close to where I am right now, right? There's been a big increase in shootings in Chicago. And so there's these big concerns about increasing violent crime in the United States as well. And these 2 sets of headlines might seem initially as sort of disconnected things, but I'd like you to think about how these 2 things might be connected public policy issues. And I'm going to think about that in the context of emergency financial assistance. So for thinking about emergency financial assistance, maybe it's useful to fix on a particular example. So I'd like you to think about a household, a family, maybe a family that's headed by a single mother, has a couple of small children, works regularly in a full-time low-paying job, usually gets by but doesn't have a lot of margin, loses that job, maybe because of the pandemic, maybe because of a past recession, what have you, and no longer can pay the rent, gets behind on rent and is at a risk of being evicted. Emergency financial assistance is going to work with a household like that to try to provide a relatively modest one-time payment to help them get through that temporary crisis situation when they're at risk of becoming homeless. And I'm going to particularly talk about one example in Chicago, the Homelessness Prevention Call Center that's operated by Catholic Charities there and draws funds from a number of different sources to help people solve this problem. Now they focus on a particular group, right? It's folks like the example I gave a moment ago who have solvable problems, who have temporary problems, not somebody who owes $10,000 in back rent or something like that, but has some sort of immediate crisis situation that's solvable with something relatively modest. So the average amount of assistance they connect people to is about $880 during the time period we're looking at. That's about 1 month of rent in Chicago. This study is going to be from a few years ago, I think the previous financial crisis rather than the current COVID pandemic. And most people are going to get back rent paid to their landlord. That will be the assistance. There are also some people who will get security deposits for a new place, or help with utility payments that they're behind on that are getting the utilities shut off. And while I'm going to be looking at an example from a couple of years ago, this type of assistance has become particularly important over the past year and a half. And so a couple hundred of these types of programs at the local level have appeared both due to local government, state government, and nonprofit organizations in response specifically to housing instability created by the pandemic. And the federal government has stepped in as well. And so if you look closely at the American Rescue Plan or at the emergency spending bill that happened in December, you add that up, there's about $50 billion in federal funding that's going to these types of programs through the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. And there's also other sources of funding in those bills that can go to this. So this has been these programs have ramped up massively over the past year and have become particularly important. And so we're going to evaluate one of them. We're going to look at the Homelessness Prevention Call Center in Chicago, and we're going to look to see its effects on violent crime when people get this type of assistance. How are we going to tell whether that household, whether this makes any sort of difference for them? We're going to look at people in this way. So there's going to be a bunch of people calling the call center. And the call center is going to be sorting them into people who are a good fit for this type of assistance versus not. So eligible people will be the sorts of folks like what I mentioned before. Imagine somebody who has been just getting by, they have a job, they lost it, they figured out how they're going to get a new job, but now they're in this in-between where they're about to lose their housing because of this temporary crisis. That's the sort of person who's going to be eligible. Somebody who had like a major medical issue come up and now they no longer can work and is behind several months of their rent. Like they're going to be ineligible because that's a more permanent change in their situation. So people who have these sort of temporary crises, that's who's going to be showing up and be a fit for this program. And then the call center is going to look to see whether they can connect that person with actual assistance. So the call center itself doesn't have assistance. It coordinates directing people to a bunch of different existing sources of assistance that come from the state of Illinois, the city, nonprofit organizations, foundations, and so on. And so they're going to check to see, for this person who's calling right now, is there money available? Is there a slot available somewhere for this person? And it turns out sometimes, unfortunately, during the time we're looking at our study, that answer was no. So sometimes those pots of money are empty because the state hasn't appropriated more money. Or sometimes the schedules for the organizations that sign people up for these and actually go through the process of paying the landlord, the schedules are full. And so you have people who are similar, who all have had these similar sort of crisis situations, who are a good fit for emergency assistance, but for whom some of them funds are available and some of them are not. And so we're going to get similar looking people, some who get funds, some who don't. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to compare those two groups of people and see, do we see different outcomes for those groups, and credit that as the effect of the program. So what happens when people get this type of assistance versus not? Well, we link the call center records to records from the Chicago Police Department to see what happens in terms of people's violent crime. And so arrests for violent crime, 12 months, within 12 months of the call, fall by about half when people are referred to assistance. So on the left, you can see the gold bar for folks for whom funds are not available. About 1.7% of them are arrested for a violent crime in the year after they call. And that's about half of that for folks who are referred to assistance. So there's this big change in violent crime arrest rates in a relative sense for those folks who are referred to assistance. Now, why are we tying together these two different strands, right? Again, you might think, okay, these seem disconnected to me. Why does emergency financial assistance matter for violence? It's worth backing up for a second and talking for a moment about some other papers in this line of research, both by me and by others that I work with here at Leo, to talk about why that might happen. So one other paper that's out there that from other folks that I work with, that they showed that for this same group of folks calling the call center, when they're referred to assistance, their entry into homeless shelters decreases as well. And so there is a way in which the purpose immediately of this assistance is to stabilize housing, and it seems to do that. Now, why would that go on to affect violence? Well, imagine, again, this sort of family that we're talking about, moving from a relatively stable housing situation to an unstable one might mean that somebody moves into a crowded situation where they're living with family members, and that's crowded and more volatile. It might lead to someone moving into shelter where, again, they're running into to a lot more folks, and there's sort of high tension situations that lead to violence. It could be a household that has a two adult headed household where housing instability or financial instability leads to tension, and that could lead to family violence. And so one part of what's going on is housing is getting stabilized, and that could be leading to reducing violence, interpersonal violence. One thing that supports that kind of interpretation of what we're seeing is if you dig into the arrest data, the big decrease in violence that we see is coming from assaults. So thinking of, right, still very costly, but lower level violence like assaults, rather than this is not coming from homicides and things like that. Some other interesting things we see in the arrest data is we actually see a little bit of an increase in property crime. From a public policy point of view, increases in shoplifting are maybe not quite as important as a decrease in assaults. So we think this is sort of overall a benefit for society, but there's some indication that some people who are getting security deposits are maybe overextending themselves a little bit. We also see a decrease in homelessness-related crimes like trespassing. Finally, I want to point out, this is a paper that's not published yet, but one thing that we found recently in a working paper we're circulating is we also actually see reductions in victimization of violence. And so not only are people who are receiving this assistance less likely to be arrested themselves, they're less likely to show up at the emergency department to be treated as a victim of assaults. And so we think, again, this idea of sort of these highly volatile, high pressure situations leading to violence on many sides is likely what's going on here. And so we do see a decrease in people showing up into the emergency department as well. So if you're a policymaker, what do you do with this? I think one big picture, I want you to think about housing stability and violent crime as being things that can be intertwined rather than separated. And particularly that assaults, the most common form of violent crime. Other forms of violent crime obviously are really, really costly, but assaults are the most common version. And those might be more tied to people's financial circumstances than we sometimes give credit for. And so when you start thinking about social insurance, particularly during like the COVID pandemic right now with greater rental protections and things that have happened, as those start falling away, you might start looking to see whether not only are those people affected, but is the broader community affected? Are crime rates affected when we are able to versus not able to provide this type of sort of broad social insurance? So those are the things I'd like to leave you with today. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. And next up is Todd Kessler.
Hi, well, thank you all for being here to watch this. I'm going to be talking about reducing violence with a job, evidence from New York City Summer Youth Employment Program lotteries. I'm Todd Kessler. I'm at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. So if we're on this call, we're interested in reducing violence. That starts when kids are younger. And one of the tools that might allow us to do this is summer youth employment programs. So these programs hire youth in the summer months. So they're happening right now. Youth get hired in July and August. Most large US cities have a summer youth employment program. They're very popular among constituents and thus electeds. And the largest program in the country is in New York City. In a typical summer, the New York City program will hire about 75,000 youth. So I'm going to be looking at this program, although I'm going to be going a bit back in time so we can follow outcomes from then forward. I'll be looking in the years 2005 to 2008, when the program was a little bit smaller, but still quite large and still the largest in the country at the time. During that period, the program offered jobs to youth aged 14 to 21, cost about $1,400 per participant. The main costs were wages, so youth were paid for 25 hours per week of work for 6 to 7 weeks in the summer, and they were paid the state minimum wage. Most of the time, 90% of the time, was spent in the job. There's some sort of job readiness workshops that happened as well, but the job was primarily for most youth a nonprofit job, but a private sector job. So there was some government employment, but mostly it's private sector nonprofit jobs. You can think of the kind of typical job as being a camp counselor or daycare center work or something that might be in high demand in the summertime and that youth can jump into without a ton of training. Now, even though New York City is quite big, the program is quite big. So what we are going to see in these years is that 8% of eligible youth, 8% of those 14 to 21 apply to the program in those years. And about half of them are going to be given a job through the program. Now, this population, it's a big swath of New Yorkers. They're typically lower income, so higher income folks might not need to work over the summer or might have access to networks that can give them a job outside of the program. The program's in high demand, and so despite being big, about half the people, as I said, are not given a job in the program. And the way that we do research with this data is that it's determined by lottery who gets given the job and who does not. So we're going to get these 8% of New Yorkers who are in this age range who apply. They'll be in our data, and some of them will be lucky, win the lottery, be offered a job and get to participate, and the others will be unlucky and not get to participate. And then we're just going to compare these two groups in the months of the program and then beyond to see what the effects are of being given a job, because otherwise, besides this luck of the draw, they're otherwise identical. We'll be looking at about 200,000 individuals. Who we're looking at will change slightly over the analyses that I'll show you, but you should think about 200,000 people, a little over half of whom got to participate in the program. Now, I'm going to be merging this data, this lottery data from New York City Summer Youth Employment Program to a bunch of outcomes. I'll tell you about them as I get there, but I'm going to start with the data from the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services. This is arrest and conviction data, and it looks at youth, the 163,000 youth in our data who were 16 years or older at the start of the program summer. That's when the arrest and conviction data becomes available for us to look at for research. So I'm going to show you a bunch of tables. These are from 2 papers that I've worked on. The papers are publicly available, so you can go look. I'll go quickly through the results because there's lots of them, but you can get a sense of what's in those papers and look more deeply if you're interested. So what you're going to see on these are contemporaneous effects. So these are effects in the program summer. The column on the left shows you the outcome that we're interested in. And each of these sets of 3 numbers gives you information on this sort of regression that we've done for this subset of youth on this outcome. So this is all youth in brackets. This is the mean in the control group, the youth who do not get given the job. And what you see for any arrest in the program summer is about 8 out of every 1,000 youth are arrested at some point during those 2 months. And then what you see at the top of each set of 3 numbers is the effect of the program, of getting a job through the program on this outcome. So what we see is that this 8 youth per 1,000, it goes down by 1.3 youth if they are given a job. So this is a decrease of nearly 20% in the likelihood that a youth is arrested during the program summer. You see this is true also felony arrests and number of arrests. The fact that this is, sorry, I should say these are in percentage points. That's why it's 1.3 out of 1,000. This is an actual number of arrests. These numbers are very similar. Basically just means that if you are arrested at some point during the summer, it's probably your only arrest during that summer. Now, in the columns on the right, this is where we split our data by what we call being at risk, which is just a definition for whether you have been arrested prior to the Summer Youth Employment Program. And that's going to be our indicator that you might be at risk for criminal justice contact. And what you see is that the effects on all youth, they're negative for both the at-risk and the low-risk group, but they're coming primarily from the low-risk group. Here, these youth there's a 12% chance that a youth who was arrested prior to the program summer will be arrested during the program summer. And we're decreasing that by about 3 percentage points, so about 25% if they're given a job in the summer. So these are the effects in the program summer on arrests and various types of arrests. These effects look even stronger when you look at arrests during the program summer that lead to convictions. So here things are more significant, more stars. But again, it's the same pattern. It's sort of negative for everyone, and it's driven primarily by the at-risk youth. But in this group, we're decreasing the likelihood of a conviction by about 1/3 to 1/2, depending on the outcome we're looking at. Those are effects during the program summer. How about after the program summer? So we have some data, sort of, looking at that data, we can look out for quite a while. And there's some indication that the likelihood of an arrest is continuing to decrease after the program summer. This is the cumulative treatment effect on felony arrests for about 2 years after. And while we see sort of directionally negative effects in our arrest and conviction data, I'm actually going to look at longer term effects from different data sets that are shown in a different paper. And the next thing I'm going to show you is on the likelihood of being incarcerated in New York State prison by 2013. Okay, so this is 5 to 8 years after the program summer. And the tables look a little different because they're from a different paper, but it's the same kind of idea, where what we're going to do is we're going to look at the mean for the folks who are not in, do not get a summer job. And here we see it's about 1% of individuals who are in the control group by 2013 have been incarcerated in New York State prison. And the program decreases the likelihood of that happening by about 10%. Okay, so this is an outcome that it takes a while to end up there, and that's why we're looking out quite a number of years. It's also, this data set only lets us look at individuals who are incarcerated for an offense that they committed at age 19 or older. Okay, and so for that reason and others, we split this outcome by age group, and we see that the biggest effect comes from the 19 and older cohort, which means some of those contemporaneous effects that we saw in the program summer might be related to what we see here. Right, but this is also a teaser for the table that's in the paper that shows you lots more demographic splits. As you might expect, though, I will point out that the effect is primarily driven by males rather than females. So this is data on incarceration. In the same paper, we merge in with data from the IRS that has death records. And we actually see an effect of the Summer Youth Employment Program, not just on incarceration, but also on mortality. So thankfully, mortality, this is by 2014. So this is, again, many years after the program. And thankfully, it's rare, but about 4 out of 1,000 people in the control group who did not get a job are dead by 2014. And the program decreases the likelihood of mortality by something on the order of 20%. Okay, so if you scale this up, in the paper, we note that the program, the New York City Summer Youth Employment Program in these years saved about 20 lives per year in this, as measured this way. What kinds of deaths are being prevented? So consistent with this idea that these are young individuals who hopefully are in relatively good health. What we're seeing is that the effects are primarily coming from external causes, and homicide is the largest of those. And this is data from New York City cause of death records, death certificates that have the cause of death on them. Okay, so what is the policy takeaway? So across all of these results that I've shown you from these two papers, right, summer youth employment programs, they're popular, they're widespread, they exist in lots of cities. They can have profound effects on youth outcomes. They help youth stay out of criminal justice contact, particularly youth who've already been arrested, or prevents them from further criminal justice contact. And we see they can have long-lasting effects on violence and youth safety and mortality. So, this is the kind of thing where when there's a program that exists, the push might be to increase the size of the program, provide it to more youth, and that's something that we've seen happen in New York City since our results were initially published. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Jed. And Priscilla Hunt is up next. Oh, you're muted, Priscilla.
There we go. All right, now let's share the screen again. You should see that. No? Yeah.
There we go.
There we go. Okay, excellent. So again, thank you for the invitation. I'm going to talk about the predictive policing strategy that occurred in Chicago in 2012. It's not moving. Here we go. And I'm going to give a bit of context before getting into our evaluation, because again, this happened almost a decade ago, and this was a time in which there was a lot of movement towards sort of data-driven identification of places and people, and then intervening in those places and people. And so predictive policing, if you haven't heard about it, has places, which is really this like hotspot policing, if you've ever heard of that, with trying to forecast places that are likely to experience a crime. And in terms of people, this fit under a strategy of intelligence-led policing, if you've ever heard of that, where you're really trying to identify people who are likely to commit or be a victim of a crime and intervene. And so in the late 90s, there was this proactive policing, police departments trying, rather than patrolling an area and trying to find the right place to patrol and then respond to a call, there were these interventions. Boston ceasefire is one that comes up a lot, where they worked with individuals who were involved in gangs, and they worked with sort of social workers and courts and prosecutors, and had these interventions with people before they would commit another crime, and try to prevent gang-related violence that way. And there's also, I put up High Point model for violent repeat offenders, because High Point starts looking at all different kinds of offenses and really targeting interventions with those offenders. So you have violent repeat offenders, and then High Point's going to have another intervention that's with, for example, domestic violence and individuals who have previous domestic violence charges. And so then in the mid 2000s, when we have September 11th attacks, police are often working more at that point of like intelligence gathering and identifying individuals who are more likely to commit an offense, and really looking at the data. So big data gets a name in 2005, and you hear a lot of predictive analytics. We're going to predict places. We've got all this data. We can run all these models, and we're going to figure out crime before it happens, where it happens, who it happens to. And so then there started to be a lot of funding around, okay, let's evaluate, let's see if these predictive analytics work. And so there's a program called PredPol. There was a lot of programs. LAPD is going to use it in 2008. And then by 2012, Chicago is being named as the murder capital of the US. Not the highest crime rates as a rate, sort of per capita in the US, but as a big city, it's had the largest numbers of homicides. And so they're really actively trying to use programs, use interventions to try to reduce homicides. And at that time, it was about data and identifying people or places. And so they're going to look at this people-based predictive policing strategy to reduce homicides. So what did that look like? So the intervention was, they're going to predict people who are at higher risk of becoming a homicide victim. And the way that they're going to do this is that they have a database of people who've been arrested for a crime, of course, and they're going to see who people were arrested with, whether or not the people you've been arrested with have been a homicide victim. And they're going to see whether or not that increases the likelihood of you being a homicide victim. So we're going to call that a first degree link, where you see here subject, that's an individual who's been arrested, and their co-defendants are whether or not they've been homicide victims, and how that increases the likelihood of becoming a victim. And they're also going to include second degree links. That's if I'm arrested with somebody who was also arrested with somebody else, and did that person become a homicide victim? Okay, so they're going to see people who have been arrested with other people who have been a homicide victim, and see that it does in fact increase the likelihood of you being a homicide victim yourself. And then everybody in Chicago is, not everybody in Chicago is put on a list, but everybody is in this database. And then people who are at higher risk are put on what was called an SSL, or strategic subject list, by district. So in each district of Chicago, they're going to have a list of people who are at the highest likelihood of becoming a victim of a homicide. And what are they going to do with those people? That became also a subject of discussion. In practice, what happened was they made contact with people on the list. So how we test whether or not that worked, it's similar to what you've seen of colleagues who've previously discussed. You have in this database, you have everybody who's been arrested, and some are very low risk people in terms of the likelihood of becoming a victim, in the sense that they may not have anyone that they've been arrested with who's been a homicide victim. But then you have other people who have been arrested with somebody who's likely to become a victim, but they weren't on the list. And so what we're going to do is we're going to separate out the people who are on the list. Okay, this is the SSL group, what we would call a treatment group. They're going to receive this making more contact. And we're going to then compare them with people who are higher risk, but not on the list. So I use the word comparison group here because for some reason they weren't on the list, right? They had very similar risk, very similar criminal history. All of these things were very similar and that they weren't on the list. So we're going to do a lot of tests to make sure, there was some decision to not put them on the list. And some of these decisions, frankly, were they had to have a shorter list. So some districts had a list of 20 people. And so the 21st person just wasn't on the list because they couldn't have everyone on the list. And so here giving you the risk scores, again, we compare those people with similar risk. Not everybody had the highest risk number. Some districts had people with lower risk. So some people will have, a risk score of 17, 24, 31, but in that district, they were higher risk. And they're compared to other people with similar risk and similar criminal histories. And so one of our main results is that we found that there was no effect on victimization for being on the SSL. The point being, you were put on a list, you were at higher risk of becoming a victim. Police were making increased contact with those people, and we have some evidence to show that that was indeed the case, that they had more contact. And here what I'm showing in that first column of that estimate is that the likelihood of somebody being a shooting victim was reduced, but not statistically significant, meaning there just is no difference of whether or not you were put on the SSL. Similarly, no difference about being a murder victim. And when we looked at any weapon outcome, maybe that's where we could have seen an effect. We still see no effect of being on that SSL. And for those who are familiar with the SSLs, we were evaluating the pilot, the very first one. And so there was discussions that the list got sort of improved and more targeted. So this is the very first list that they had, and no difference. In terms of numbers, what that looks like. So there were 405 homicides in Chicago during our evaluation period, and that was March 2013 to March 2014. And most people who were a victim of a homicide did have a criminal record, but they had none of the links. So that's the 62%. The 21% had no criminal record. So they were definitely not on the list, and they were not in our comparison group either. For those who had a criminal record and had links but were not on the list that were in our comparison group, that was 16% of the people who had homicides. And so only 1% of the people who were a victim of a homicide in Chicago that year were on the SSL list. The other main results I want to share is that the people on the list were about 3 times more likely to be arrested for a shooting. And so when you do the sort of transformation that you need to do, there's the third column there on the right. The only statistically significant finding we have is that they're more likely to be arrested for a shooting. And no change in murder arrest. And so the big question that always came up was, okay, well, you put them on a list and then told Chicago police to go make contact with them, so they got arrested. That seems like a logical conclusion. So we went and actually tested whether that was the case, because we had their field cards. We had all the contacts that they said that they were making with people. So what we find is, as we do this mediation analysis, and we find, okay, take all the people who were on the SSL list and take those who were arrested for shootings and look at the police contacts. In fact, look at all of them, but look at police contacts. Is it the case that people who were arrested for a shooting also had more police contact? And that's not it. So we don't find a statistically significant finding there. It was not the case that they were more likely to be arrested for a shooting because they were on the list and getting more contact. Now, for this to not be true, it would take that the police kind of systematically didn't write up field contact cards for people who were on the SSL. Meaning I've got all of these numbers of police contact, and the reason I'm finding that this isn't what's driving their arrest is that they weren't writing it down. But we went to all the CompStat meetings during that period. We had some great assistance from folks at the University of Chicago who were at the CompStat meetings, and we were documenting the discussion about the SSL. And at that time, it's not like now when people heard about the SSL, people were not talking about it in the same way. It was just you can go look, make contact. It was not that big of a deal. So we have reason to believe this was the relationship. So what did we learn? The policy. I have never experienced a study in which we were compared to a movie more than this one, that this was somehow a Minority Report. And so I think whenever a strategy comes out, a future one following the homicides, I think we want to kind of be careful about what the strategy looks like and what people do. At that time, it became the discussion about how bias is underlying the algorithms, because the whole strategy started with if you are arrested. And so if there's bias in who gets arrested, there's ultimately bias in who we're going to predict. Second, there are some discussions about what did work because we didn't see a whole lot in terms of homicides and victimization, and whether or not this might be a good way for identifying people for investigative purposes, and about what didn't work. Is it the case that we need better predictions and targeting the right folks? We didn't have the right information there, or those interventions. I talked about how they said they made contact with people. What was happening in Boston and High Point were actually sit downs with people and their families, and it was far more involved with other sort of institutions, social workers. And so that's a direction that people are talking more about now. Okay, and with that, I'll finish. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Priscilla. And I am up next, so if you take your slides down, there we go, and I can put mine up. All right, folks can see those okay? Great, okay, so I'm gonna talk to you all today about the effects of DNA databases on crime, particularly on deterrence and detection of offenders. This is joint work with Anne-Sophie Anker and Rasmus Landerstow, who both at the Rockwell Foundation in Denmark and had access to amazing data that we're able to use for this study. And so the motivation for this study is that DNA databases and a whole bunch of other what I think of as similar high-tech tools is expanding around the world. And all of these tools work by increasing the probability of getting caught rather than increasing the punishment. So instead of putting people in prison for longer and longer and hoping that will deter crime, the goal is to identify offenders more quickly and with more accuracy and higher likelihood in order to deter them that way and perhaps take serial offenders off the streets more quickly. And so these tools have a lot of potential, but they essentially work by keeping better tabs on everyone, right? So there's a surveillance component that people worry about quite a bit, and this brings privacy costs. And so reasonably, citizens want to know what they're getting in exchange for their privacy. And so in this paper, we consider the effects of DNA databases on recidivism in Denmark using the timing of a massive database expansion as a natural experiment. So the research question we have in mind is, what are the effects of DNA databases on the individuals who are added to the database? And the punchline I'm going to show you is that the DNA databases have a big deterrent effect on criminal behavior. So what are DNA databases? Basically, you collect a saliva swab from someone who is supposed to be added to the database and use that DNA sample from the saliva swab to create an identifying string of numbers that are unique to you. You can think of this as being akin to a social security number, where the numbers themselves don't have any inherent meaning, but they are unique to you. And I think crucially, people worry that because it's DNA, it involves lots of sensitive health information. That is not the way they're used in this context. So it doesn't involve analyzing anything else about you. It's basically just coming up with this number. So qualifying offenders are added to government DNA databases where their identifying numbers, this DNA profile, are compared with identifying numbers from DNA left at crime scenes. And in this way, then, DNA databases match profiled offenders with DNA from crime scene evidence. And so the purpose here is to lead authorities to a suspect they would not otherwise have identified through their traditional investigative methods. And in general, it's very difficult to avoid leaving DNA at a crime scene, even property crimes. And we think of this as being, there's DNA if there's a big pool of blood, but even in property crimes, you can analyze much smaller pieces of DNA at this point. And so it can be useful for all kinds of crimes. So we can almost think of it as being a more accurate and more useful fingerprint in many ways. And then local law determines which groups of offenders are required to provide a DNA sample. In the US, this is all legislated at the state level. In most countries, it's the national level. Databases are typically expanded over time from serious offenders to more minor offenders. At this point, all US states require anyone convicted of a felony to be added to the state DNA database. And those are all linked up to CODIS, which is run by the FBI, so you can compare people across states. The policy frontier in the US at this point is adding anyone arrested for a crime or people convicted of more minor offenses like misdemeanors. And so here is a map as of 2018. So it's a little out of date, but it's hard to get up-to-date policy metrics on this from the NCSL. This is all the states that include at least some arrestees in the DNA database. You can see it's a good number of states, but not all of them. And this is not necessarily all arrestees. It might be like only arrestees in very serious violent crimes, for instance. So let me tell you a little bit about Denmark's DNA database and the policy change we're going to look at here. So the database was first established in that country in the year 2000. At that point, it only included those charged with very serious violent offenses and only in cases where DNA was actually necessary for the current investigation. So if DNA was not relevant in the investigation, then that person was not in the database. Then in 2005, there was an expansion that added anyone charged with a crime punishable by at least 1.5 years in prison. So this is roughly comparable to anyone charged with a felony in the United States. It also removed that requirement about relevance to the investigation. And so you also had some people that were very serious offenders who were excluded before, and now they would be added. This policy change was effective in May 25th, 2005. A relatively unique thing about the Denmark context is that people in Denmark, like many Europeans, take real summer vacations. And so everyone goes on vacation this summer, the criminals and the police officers alike. And so the police departments were severely understaffed during June through August. As you'll see in the graphs I'll show you, the implementation was a little slow. So we have to do a bunch in the paper to deal with that. But in general, there's a huge jump in the share of all offenders who were added to the database. Of everyone who was charged with a crime in Denmark, it went from about 4% of those people were added to the DNA database in May to about 40% by October. So a really big expansion. So how are we going to use this database expansion to measure the causal effect on the offender's behavior? So I want you to imagine two identical offenders. One happens to be charged on May 24th, one happens to be charged on May 25th. That database expansion goes into effect on May 25th. That means the first guy does not go in the DNA database, but the second one does. But everything else about them is the same, and they're living through the same context. Policing is the same, everything else is the same. But the second person, the person who's charged just 1 day later, is now in this DNA database and can be linked to other crimes that he commits in the future when law enforcement otherwise might not have thought of him. And so when we can think of this as almost this date of charge being essentially like randomizing people into treatment or not, right? And so that means that, as I'm going to show you, when we see that the first person, the people who are not in the DNA database, are much more likely to be charged and convicted of crimes going forward, we can attribute that difference in the subsequent behavior to the effect of that treatment of being added to DNA registration. So just a quick note on what we're measuring. So you can think of this natural experiment helping us control for everything else that's going on. So all of the societal changes or changes in the criminal justice system, including a general increase in the collection and use of DNA evidence, are going to affect those charged both before and after that reform. So those charged just before the expansion are going to serve as comparison group or control group for all those other changes. Another thing you should keep in mind is that police can get a warrant to obtain DNA from anyone identified as a suspect in a crime. So being added to the DNA database increases the probability that someone is identified in a suspect in the first place in cases where they would not otherwise be on law enforcement's radar. So if you have, a woman who was murdered, the husband's probably the most likely suspect, you don't need a DNA database to tell you that, right? So there are lots of cases where, for various reasons, you don't need the DNA database to lead you to give you more leads, but in a lot of cases you do. And so that's what we're measuring here. We're interested in what effect does that have on reoffending, and those are the results I'm going to show you. So here's just essentially the first stage effect. What's the effect of the reform on the likelihood of being added to the DNA database? And so this is showing you the share of all individuals charged with a crime who are added to Denmark's DNA database. And so you can see leading up to the reform, it's pretty flat. It's around 4%. These gray dots are the summer holidays that I mentioned when everyone's on vacation. But you can see by about October, it starts leveling off. There's still, quite a bit of churn, so it doesn't become totally flat. There are always new people entering the criminal market, but we get this big jump from basically April or May to October. And then this is what happens to recidivism. So this is showing you the probability that individual offenders are convicted of any new crime within 1 year. We can look in the paper up to 3 years out, and basically the results are all very similar. Basically, these are the people that are charged, all the way back to 2003 through 2005. It's pretty flat what the recidivism rate is. And then these are the summer months when a lot of people aren't being added because they're understaffed. But we see this big drop, basically. Once you actually get everybody who's supposed to be in the database in there, we see this big reduction in their likelihood of reoffending, and that is a 42% reduction. And of course, because we're more likely to be detecting you in the first place if you're in the database, we're more likely to find you and convict you. This is going to be biased a little bit upward, actually. So we show in the paper, we can kind of separate that and do a lot of fancy stuff there. But basically, most of this effect is coming through deterrence. And so it's pretty, the punchline is pretty close to that big 42% drop in the likelihood of a new conviction and a new crime. We can also look at the number of new convictions that individuals are convicted of. This is again within 1 year, and we see a somewhat similar result. We see here the drop is even more apparent. The number of new convictions falls by 49%. So we can, dig into the types of offenders who are most affected and the types of crimes that are prevented. So the overall effects do include big drops in violent crime. So we see a 48% in decline in new convictions for those who were initially added to the database because of a violent charge. And we can also see that there's a 60% decline in new convictions in subsequent violent crime convictions. And the other kind of things I want to point out here is the effects are bigger for first-time offenders, and especially for younger offenders, people age 18 to 23. So putting people into the database early in their criminal justice career can be more helpful. So what are the policy takeaways here? This research shows that adding people charged with a felony offense to a government DNA database has important public safety benefits. Increasing the probability of getting caught for future offenses has a big deterrent effect on both violent and property crime. Adding people when they're younger and earlier in their criminal careers has the biggest benefits. And in case you're thinking, what does Denmark have to do with the US? I have an earlier paper using US data, much messier US data, but still data from the US, finding very similar or results that are very much in line with these overall effects. So what the other kind of thing to keep in mind is you're thinking about policy, or what are the costs? So that's about the benefits, right? What are the costs here? The financial costs of expanding existing DNA databases are relatively low, but the main cost to consider that people worry about is privacy. So DNA databases do require collecting genetic material. They do only use that material to create an identifying string of numbers. So think again, it's a more accurate fingerprint, but reasonable people differ in how much they worry about this, right? One thing I want to highlight, though, is that alternative strategies can be much more invasive. So if you think about things like putting cameras everywhere, or increasing police surveillance, or putting people in prison for a really long time, those all are also really invasive and invade your privacy. And so it's not, DNA databases are nothing. So, and I think especially when used as an alternative to incarceration, there's real potential here for DNA databases to dramatically reduce the overall invasiveness of the criminal justice system and reduce mass incarceration. And so I will leave it there. I do have a Bloomberg op-ed on this if you're interested in something in writing. And of course, everything is on my website. Yeah, thank you very much. And now I'll hand it over to Kevin Schneppel.
Great, thanks, Jen. Let me share my screen. So thanks for the invitation, and I'll close out this really fascinating panel by talking about lead exposure and the relationship between that and violent crime, highlighting some research among others, including myself, and getting into more details into the specific paper I'm going to be talking about. But before I do that, I'd just like to draw attention to a really excellent roundup that Jen, who we just heard from, has done for Niskanen Center. And so here's the URL here. So I'd like to, there's a really excellent summary of all the recent work in this area. And some of the key findings in the papers that were highlighted by Jennifer in this article is: one, lead in drinking water increased homicide rates in the early 20th century, and that's using data across the US. It does appear that removing lead from gasoline reduced violent crime in the US. And there's some papers finding this across the US. And then third, there's some recent work that links exposure to lead as a child to school suspensions and juvenile delinquency in Rhode Island. So I'll refer you to Jen's article to get all the details on those papers. But I think, the general consensus in the recent work that really tries to uncover a causal relationship that is pointing towards very large and substantial effects of lead exposure early on in life and violent behavior later on in juvenile years as well as adult years. And so the paper that I'm going to be talking about today is one that we're not going to directly test this causal relationship between lead exposure and crime. Rather, we're going to be looking at the effect of an intervention that was targeting kids with high levels of exposure on their behavior, criminal activity as juveniles. And so this work is joint with Steve Billings. I'm Kevin Schneppel. I'm at Simon Fraser University up in British Columbia, Canada. And so I'm going to highlight some of the findings from this paper and then talk about the policy implications. So one thing that's important, I think, to mention is what are the sources of exposure and which sources are really the most important contributors to exposure today. Lead paint hazards are a really important source of exposure and continue to be so today, as well as water through drinking water systems. There's a lot of lead in old plumbing underneath our cities in the US. And so, this is highlighted by the crisis in Flint, Michigan and other cities, and that's an important source of exposure. There's a lot of lead in the soil across our urban areas, and that's, settled. It could be from chipped paint, but also settled lead from when petrol and gasoline used to have a very high content of lead, and that settled into the soil. So those are really important sources of exposure. The context that I'm going to be talking about really is focused on the lead paint hazards within older homes in the US. And so there's an estimate of about 1 out of every 4 homes in the US may contain a significant lead paint hazard, and that continues to be true today. The CDC recommends blood lead testing around 1 and 2 years old for all kids. Some states require these tests or proof of these tests when kids are entering into the school systems. But monitoring is a really important piece of this paper that I'm talking about today. But this monitoring of which kids might have been exposed is important, and that's part of the context here in the conversation going forward, I think, in terms of the policy implications. And so what typically happens across the US is that if these tests of young children reveals concerning levels of exposure, a combination of actions is recommended. And this can range from providing information to parents about exposure, the dangers of exposure, how to reduce exposure, to triggering remediation from, say, a HUD lead-based paint remediation funding program, to case management type approaches and developmental monitoring of kids that are testing high early on in life. And so what we're going to do in this paper is match these blood lead level test results. And this is all in Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. We've been able to match those testing results with the administrative school and arrest records. And this is for children born between 1990 and 1997. An important note in terms of this context is Charlotte is a relatively modern city compared to a lot of other cities in the US. And so the lead paint hazard is lower in Charlotte than it is in a lot of other places. And so, you know, we expect that these interventions are also having potential benefits in some of these other cities with higher risks of exposure. One thing I just want to point out, and this is not to the causality yet, and again, we're not going to get at this direct link between lead and violent behavior, but you know, and this correlation has been documented in many different papers for many decades. If you look at the test results, and I'll draw your attention down here to the violent crime panel, these are just average violent crime arrests rates, you know, in that juvenile period for individuals by the level of their blood lead test results. And you see this very almost monotonic increasing relationship. So as we see higher levels of exposure through these test results, we see higher rates of arrests for violent crimes. And it's quite striking, this gradient and this relationship. But one thing to note is that this isn't necessarily causal. There's a lot of other factors that could be correlated with higher levels of exposure and individuals who are living in these deteriorating homes or these disadvantaged neighborhoods and these types of arrest records. And so what we're trying to get at in this paper is what you see hinted at down here is in terms of evaluating this intervention that's going to target kids with really high levels of lead exposure as detected in these test results with this kind of package intervention. And what we're finding in our paper is a very dramatic decrease in the rate of arrests for especially the violent behavior as juveniles. So how are we going to get at the causal impact of this intervention, the CDC recommended intervention on criminal activity? We're going to use the fact that in North Carolina, what happens that if your test result, your initial test result is over what at the time was the alert threshold or the threshold of concern, 10 micrograms per deciliter, there will be an intervention, or if the first test is over, there's a second confirmatory test. And if that second test is over, then it qualifies that individual for an intervention. Whereas if that second confirmatory test is just under the threshold, that individual would not qualify for this intervention. And so what we're using here really is there's a lot of randomness in terms of how well these tests measure exposure in terms of, you know, there can be measurement error, and most of these tests are finger prick tests, and it's well documented, there's a lot of measurement error in that. The test is going to measure exposure over a relatively recent period of time. And so depending on when the exposure shock happens, that there could be differences in whether kids are getting the second confirmatory test over versus not. And importantly, what we're seeing across all the things we can observe about these children in terms of those that have the two tests over versus those that have the first test over and the second one just under, is that they're observationally equivalent. So we see balance across the characteristics we can observe. And then our assumption is that the balance would also hold across a lot of the unobservable things that would be correlated or lead to different types of behavior later on in life. And so in this sense, our study here approximates a randomized controlled trial. So just to summarize the results very quickly, we find very substantial declines across most measures of criminal behavior for kids whose second test qualifies them for an intervention. And these effect sizes are quite big. If we look at the arrest here on average in the control group, so those with one test over and then one test just under that didn't qualify for the intervention, the average arrest rate is about 18%, or we see about 18% of those kids with arrest records as juveniles. This is about halving or decreasing that risk by about 40%. And for the violent arrest, it's an even bigger effect. And so again, these aren't necessarily a direct causal impact of lead on outcomes, but suggest that the CDC recommended response, which often includes reducing exposure risk within the household and kind of cutting off that continued exposure risk through these lead paint remediations, along with nutritional advice and a lot of other kind of a package of interventions. This work strongly suggests that this response can really reduce violent crime decades later. And so I think, it might be a nice paper to conclude this panel, because I think all the other talks we heard were very short-term responses to violent crime, which of course are important to think about and talk about given the climate today. But this really is more about long-term policy action that could prevent violent crime down the road. And so I thank you for your time. Any questions and comments are very welcome. Feel free to email me, look me up, and I'm happy to chat further. So thanks to Jen and everyone. And I think Jen's going to get back on and conclude.
Yes, thank you, Kevin, and thanks to everyone for the great presentations. We are about at time, so I just want to encourage you all to come back next week for the next. So this is a 5-week series, and we'll be in the same time, same place. You can find the registration link for the next webinar wherever you found the registration link to this one. I will be tweeting about it as well, so you can keep tabs there if you are looking for that link. And we'll have a new set of 5 researchers next week with a different set of research papers. So thanks again, and hopefully I will see you then. Have a good day.